Hi students, here we are. I wanted to go through a spying document with you that we already touched on if you watched the video before this on the Albany Plan of the Union. Now the Albany Plan of the Union was this political, I guess you could say, unification proposal by Ben Franklin to get the colonies to kind of come together. Now what I told you is both colonists and British Parliament, the British representatives, rejected this plan, but I feel like in 1754, if they would have maybe considered it and made it happen, it could have stopped a lot of the anger issues that continued to fester after the end of the French and Indian War, which is going to bring about the independence movement in the next couple of decades. So this is what we consider to be the first political cartoon. And if you just kind of start looking at it and looking it over, let's look at the author. We know the artist was Ben Franklin. Now, if you know anything about Ben Franklin, he was an older statesman. He was from Pennsylvania. He was a newspaper editor. He actually owned the Philadelphia Gazette. And we can see that this was published on May 9th, 1754. Now think about what's going on in 1754. The French and Indian War has already begun, 1754 to 1763. The French and Indian War has already begun, and Franklin has proposed the Albany Plan of the Union. So this is all kind of happening simultaneously. And if you look at this political cartoon, you can see this serpent, this snake, is disjointed, right? We see SC, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. You see that big loop of Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England, the whole head. And so Ben Franklin kind of creates this political cartoon to say, listen, if we're divided and segmented up, we're not going to survive. Like, we need to come up with a unified policy to defend ourselves, to make sure that we continue to have the best trade, that France doesn't get too heavy-handed, that we don't have to worry about the Native American resistance to what we're doing. And this is published in the newspaper. So we could assume, he wants people who would read the newspaper, to see it. And if it's in the Philadelphia Gazette, well, those are going to be city people who live in that area. Probably not out on the frontier areas because they probably wouldn't have access to the newspaper, but it would be people who are kind of more involved in politics who would have lived in the cities. Merchants, lawyers, people who were more educated perhaps and lived in the cities who would have read this. So, if you think about a prompt would be, to what extent was this effective? Was Franklin effective at getting the colonies to unite? And you can probably, think about it and say, not really. This was a really intriguing. In fact, maybe you've seen this join or die, maybe on a flag or somebody's t-shirt or whatever it might be. This is a famous political cartoon, one of the first. It is actually the first that we've ever come across, but it didn't really work. And I feel like if they would have listened to Ben Franklin a little more, we could have saved ourselves a lot of heartache come the American Revolution. So the other thing I want to talk about, which has a lot to do with actually the Albany Plan of the Union, which is really a failure, is Pontiac's rebellion. Now, if you heard the video before, we heard a lot about Pontiac, and he was a tribal chief from the area of near the Great Lakes. He was from Fort Detroit, that area near Fort Detroit, and he had a large kind of tribal following of Ottawa, Ojibwa, Kickapoo, a lot of different Native American groups. Now, Pontiac's rebellion can't really be attributed to Chief Pontiac himself, But he is this Ottawa chief, and basically lots of different tribes are kind of going against British colonies. So you can see the fire there, the British fort taken by Indians, British fort attacked but not taken, a British fort abandoned, a French fort. The French are still in these areas, even though after the Paris Peace Treaty, the French had to leave some of these areas. And the battle site points of interest in colonial crown. You see where Philadelphia is. That's where Franklin would have been. You see where Fort Pitt is. And I mentioned Fort Pitt, I think. This is Fort Duquesne. This is where Washington would have delivered his message when he came from Virginia with his group of militiamen to say, hey, French, you need to leave. That was way back in 1754. Well, now when defeat is basically inevitable by the French, Pontiac's War is happening, and all of these rebellions are continuing to happen all over this area. And we talked about really the importance of the Proclamation of 1763. So if you look at this, the conflicts shown on the map most directly resulted in the expulsion of the French from most of North America. Well, definitely not, because they're still in Canada. B, the removal of British troops from the Ohio Valley. You know, the Ohio Valley was so very, very important because the Ohio River met up with the Mississippi River, which meant that you had access into the Gulf of Mexico. Incredibly important trade route. Well, the British troops were not removed from the Ohio Valley. The forcing of Native Americans onto reservations, not yet. In 1763, reservations haven't been set up yet. They will be eventually, not yet. Indeed, the slowing of Britain's westward expansion in North America. The answer is D, and we know it because of the Proclamation of 1763. When, the tribes came together to really unite themselves against the British force, but really more important, it forced Britain to not only kind of get along better after Pontiac's rebellion with Native American tribes, but to stop and slow the settlement past that imaginary line, the Proclamation of 1763 line. Past, you couldn't now live, if you were a colonist, in these areas because it would have been beyond that line. That's an important point. And so it was the slowing of Britain's westward expansion. The Pontiac's rebellion was not considered a success, but it did make the British authorities realize we got a problem and we cannot keep fighting this way, or we are going to lose big time. And probably not lose like you're going to get booted out, probably lose money. And to Britain, you are rich and you want to stay that way. All right, so I wanted to go through those couple of things with you, and I didn't want to add it all in on the last video section. So talk to you again.